But first tonight, the upcoming election is not just about policies, but values, and the values that we want to underpin the governing of our country. Well, Peter Dutton today spoke with precision and clarity as he promised to return conviction and principles to foreign policy if he wins the election. He gave a major speech to the Lowy Institute, focusing on foreign affairs and defence. He spoke of Russia, Ukraine, China and Israel. And his message today was one of strength in the face of our adversaries, an unwavering friendship with our allies who share our values. This was shockingly refreshing to hear.
Our foreign policy will be underpinned by moral clarity. I believe there is right and wrong and good and evil in the world, of course. In many ways, democracies have lost their resolve and their confidence because we've become susceptible to the false arguments of advocates, of keyboard warriors and conspiracy theorists who distort morality for political ends.
Keyboard warriors indeed. And Dutton posed the question that if we don't stand with friends and allies during their darkest hour, then who will stand with us in ours? In cutting remarks, Dutton said Albanese's weakness and inexperience in defence, diplomacy and national security were now endangering Australians.
The government is the most left-wing since the Whitlam government of the 70s, and we are less safe because of it. History has shown that acquiescence or appeasement ends in a cul-de-sac of strategic misfortune or worse.
His criticism of the Albanese government was brutal. He didn't only highlight Albanese's weakness, but his inexperience. And Dutton said that in Albanese's 26 years in the parliament, he'd never held a single national security or economic portfolio and basically had no experience in foreign affairs. It's why Albanese is dominated by Penny Wong's warped, radical leftist view of the world. And Dutton described Albanese's leadership as morally confused. And isn't it just?
The reason we've seen catastrophic failures in defence, diplomacy and national security under the government is that Anthony Albanese has not provided strong, clear-sighted and values-driven leadership. Instead of prioritising the national interest in international policy, the Prime Minister has been driven by political expediency. All too often he views foreign policy through the lens of domestic opportunism. Because he has the wrong priorities, Anthony Albanese's decisions have rightly been defined by weakness.
It's inarguably and uncontroversially true that we've seen lily-livered weakness from Albanese in the face of hostile dictatorships. Just as the world is aghast at Trump's embrace of Putin, the same can be said of Albanese cozying up to China. Even when Beijing challenged our sovereignty or deliberately injured our defence personnel, Albanese failed to utter a harsh word. He failed to confront Xi when he saw him in person at the G20. And more recently, Albanese insisted China had given warning of live fire exercises in the Tasman Sea, when in fact they outrageously hadn't. Well, this submissiveness, and it is submissiveness, it's earned him the patronising moniker of handsome boy with the Chinese. And Dutton warned today that the tensions in our region could escalate into conflict. And he spoke of the need to maintain a respectful relationship and a healthy trade relationship with China while still calling out aggression.
But time and again, the government has failed to call out the Chinese Communist Party's military aggression against men and women of the Australian Defence Force. Red lines need to be made clear, especially in a period of tension. Because if they're not, we end up with a situation like the one in recent weeks. A situation where the Chinese Navy provided no notice of its live fire exercise whilst it circumnavigated Australia. A situation where our national maritime surveillance was outsourced to a Virgin airline pilot.
And Dutton said self-censorship was a price that no self-respecting country should ever pay, especially a democracy like ours. Well, then on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Albanese claims to stand with Ukraine, but still hasn't fulfilled some basic requests that have been made of us. And that includes delivering M1 Abrams tanks, also requests for our thermal coal in winter, or donating out-of-service MRH-90 Taipan helicopters. Instead, they were torn apart and buried. Albanese now says he wants to send Australian troops into harm's way, yet he didn't even think it was safe enough to open our embassy in Kiev. I mean, these are utterly bizarre and conflicting comments. Well, Dutton spoke today about his personal disappointment in how President Zelensky was treated at the White House, but then he also praised Donald Trump's objective to want to end the conflict. And then on Israel, as you know, Australia has utterly abandoned our strategic ally in the Middle East. And Dutton today described this as the Prime Minister's most egregious foreign policy failure. In a portion of his speech, he described each step of Penny Wong and Albanese's horrific failures, and then he spoke about how he'd fix them.
Following Hamas's barbaric attack on Israel, the government should have sent a strong and clear message that it stood with our ally. Instead, the government's response was supine. We began to hear unreasonable calls for immediate restraint, calls for Israel to not look back in anger, calls for Israel to de-escalate and to pause its military response. Now, these calls persisted, despite hostages remaining in chains and being executed. These calls continued despite Hamas's odious terror network remaining active. And these calls endured while Hezbollah rained down thousands of rockets on Israel and while the Houthis and Iranian regime launched missile and drone attacks.
Now, Dutton also spoke about how Penny Wong's call for unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state, while Hamas continues to hold hostages, was effectively an endorsement of Hamas's use of terror to achieve political ends. And Dutton said Israel has been treated as though it were an adversary and not a friend.
The government has adopted adversarial positions towards Israel to shore up Labor's votes in certain seats where there are undeniably anti-Israel and anti-Semitic views.
And how true is that? Now, these are relations that Dutton says he will restore if he becomes Prime Minister.
If I become Prime Minister, one of my first orders of business will be to call Prime Minister Netanyahu to build on the one-on-one meeting I had with him during my recent visit and to help rebuild the relationship Labor has trashed. Israel will be able to count on our support again in the United Nations. And again, UNRWA has employed terrorists from Hamas who participated in the 7 October attacks. The organisation will no longer receive $1 of funding from a government that I lead.
If only this strength, this clarity was bipartisan federal foreign policy, as it once was. Our failure to stand strong and firm is part of the reason why Trump won't pick up Albanese's phone calls. He doesn't want a relationship with Albanese. His entire team are hoping that the left-wing experiment of the Albanese government will be over shortly and that they can start afresh with Dutton and figures that they already have a solid working relationship with, people like James Paterson and Andrew Hastie. Well, Dutton today said he believed he'd have a closer relationship with Trump, wouldn't be hard, and thus he'd be able to achieve better outcomes for our national interest.
And I do believe that if there's a change of government, I will be able to work with the Trump administration Mark II to get better outcomes for Australians. I will seek to meet President Trump in Washington in the early days of a Dutton coalition government.
Now, we often talk about peace through strength, and it's a message that Dutton reinforced today. He spoke about increasing defence capabilities, becoming more self-reliant as a nation, and also resilient. And he said this includes developing energy security and fuel reserves. He said if this didn't happen, we could be left flat-footed in uncertain times. And because we are living in uncertain times, more than ever, we need a clear-eyed view of our enemies and our allies. We can't afford continued moral confusion. We can't afford to bow down to dictators. We need strength of leadership to protect our sovereignty, the values that underpin our democracy, and that safeguard our national security.